Here's the bottom of the foredeck with all the major structural work complete. Cleaned up a little bit. Pulled the peel ply, pulled the nails holding those cleats in place. Just lightly clean things up as needed. I've got to fill a few of these holes with epoxy. And I've trimmed this seat tongue. This is the bottom side. I'll flip this over in a minute and I'll show you the top side too. This is the top side of the foredeck. This whole thing will get glassed pretty soon. But the seam is nice and flat. I lightly sanded it. I lightly sanded the whole top actually. And I've trimmed this seat tongue so that it's flush with the cleats. Rounded over the edge, top edge. It's the visible edge. And these edges here will be up flush against the bulkhead, so they don't need to be cleated or cleaned up or anything. There's the top side of the foredeck for now. More to come. With the underside structural side of the foredeck pretty much complete, with all the cleats and so forth installed. Now I glassed the top of the foredeck. It's fully sheathed in 4-ounce fiberglass, as seen here. Nothing fancy about it. I'll cut out that hatch opening later. Wraps over this seat tongue edge a little bit. Later that'll be trimmed off. I filled all the nail holes first with epoxy. These are just left over from gluing up the various parts. Centerline seam was nice and flat and flush. I just gave everything a light sanding before the fiberglass. And it's just a simple one layer of 4-ounce fiberglass. And then over here is the hatch. It's got the little doubler on the bottom that I glued up on there yesterday. So that's the next step in the foredeck construction. This is the epoxy fill coat on the foredeck. I installed 4-ounce fiberglass this morning, wet that out, and then after that cured for much of the day, it was cured enough for me to roll on this fill coat. And the fill coat is just that. It fills the weave of the fiberglass so that it's glossy and smooth. This is just 4-ounce cloth, so it is very fine fabric, as you can see here. This way I can sand this lightly and it'll be nice and flat and smooth without disturbing the cloth underneath. And over there, just coming into the reflection, is the lid for this hatch opening. Right there. So that's the fill coat on the foredeck. With the top side of the foredeck fiberglassed and coated, I trimmed the edges to get rid of the excess fiberglass. And then after a few minor prep steps on the bottom side, the underside, just a little light sanding and cleaning up of some of the corners of these structural members, I coated the bottom with one coat of epoxy, seen here. This is the final coat that goes on before I start to fit this foredeck. But before that happens, I'm going to install the combing in there. And I coated that with epoxy earlier. I didn't coat the epoxy in here because that's going to be the bonding surface. I'll clean that up later before installation. But that'll be next once this epoxy coat cures. And then once the main bulkheads are in and a couple other steps inside the boat, then this foredeck can get fitted. But this is about all the work that happens to it on the bench. The next thing on the foredeck is this hatch combing. It's a piece of plywood with the opening already in it. And this hatch gasket recess all the way around it, all milled in there. And it fits on the underside of the foredeck right between those two structural cross members. It's just epoxied in place and clamped like this and cleaned up well because the hatch is going to fit flush in here. So we don't want any epoxy left in that opening around the edges. Pretty simple, a little fussy to clean up with all the clamps in the way, but It's just one of those things. So that's pretty much the last major thing on the foredeck before it is ready to go in the boat, as soon as the boat's ready for it. This is a quick look at the underside of that hatch combing in the foredeck. You can see it just fits right in between those cleats. It's epoxied on all edges that contact. It needs to be very strong because it's going to support the hatch and people walking on it and sitting on it and whatever they do. The foredeck's now ready to be installed as soon as the boat's ready, and that'll happen pretty soon. I actually will cut the boat in half first before installing the foredeck, because the foredeck hangs over that mid bulkhead a bit. So I'm going to cut the boat in half first. That's what it suggests. Makes it easier to install. But I've sanded the epoxy on the foredeck nice and smooth. I mean, it was smooth to begin with, but I've taken the shine off. This will get coated again once it's in the boat. And since this boat's going to be painted, it'll get sanded again and then painted. But there will be, I think, a couple more coats of epoxy over this whole thing just for toughness, because that's what it calls for. But this is all sanded. Hatches fit. There's some holes around the hatch there that I filled at the end of last time. Those eventually accept the hatch dogs that will hold that hatch down. And that's the foredeck. All construction steps complete, just awaiting installation in the boat.